Howdy and welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell. This is going to be my January reading wrap up, and holy shit, this month was off to a great start. I had a better reading month in January than any of my months in the year 2022. So I'm super excited for what this means for the rest of 2023. I ended up reading 11 books. Yes. Thank you. I did. Yeah, it really happened. That totaled up to 4,136 pages. 8 of the 11 books that I read this month met one of my goals that I set out for myself for my reading year. So I will discuss those as I get to them. But I kicked off my year with The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex E. Harrow. And I last year read The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow. Really loved it. And so I wanted to pick up this one in 2023. And since it had January in the name, I decided this was the perfect month to read this. This story was so beautiful. It is about a young girl named January, and when she is 6 years old, she discovers a door that leads to another world. The door is promptly destroyed, and she basically forgets it existed or kind of convinces herself that it wasn't really real. But as a teenager, she discovers a book talking about more of these doors, and it's very mysterious how the book came into her possession. But she starts to remember more about what happened, and she ends up being overheard talking about these doors by a member of a secret society that is trying to prevent these doors from being known. So she has to go on the run, and she's trying to find her father and discover more of these doors and discover more about her past and what's really going on with her life and with these other worlds. So it's very interesting. It is, I would say, a love story to stories. Alex E. Harrow's writing is just absolutely beautiful. It is very slow paced, especially in the first half, which was my main complaint about The Once and Future Witches, but I absolutely will pick up more things by Alex E. Harrow in the future. I just absolutely adored this. The second book that I actually read this month was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. A lot of people have already heard about this book. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow won a Goodreads Reader's Choice of the Year for 2022 for Best Fiction, I believe. And so it has already gotten a lot of hype, and I definitely think the book is worth the hype. I really, really liked it. It is about two people named Sadie and Sam. They become friends when they are young kids. I want to say 11 years old when they meet in a hospital. Sam is there because he was recently in a really traumatizing car crash, and Sadie is there because her older sister has cancer. And they end up bonding over playing video games together and become really good friends. And this book kind of just follows their life over the course of several decades, where their friendship kind of ebbs and flows, but they decide when they're in college to start making video games together. They have successes and failures along the way, and I just thought this book was a really great depiction of a real friendship and kind of their strengths and their trauma and working through those things and kind of the pettiness that can sometimes arise within friendships and forgiveness and things like that. So it was really touching at times, and their friendship is platonic. And so that, I think, is not portrayed often enough in stories. And I thought that was done really well. This book, I again would say, is another love story to stories. It had just some really beautiful prose, and it talked about, the meaning of telling stories and video games and the importance of those sorts of things in our lives. And at the time that I was reading this, I was also playing a really cute little game on my phone called Monument Valley that I felt like had some parallels with this video game that they created called Hugo within the book. And so that just was some beautiful harmony in my reading experience. The downsides of this book, the author used some really big words. I know that's silly to say, but I consider myself to be very well read and have a very large vocabulary. And there were still multiple times in my reading where I was reading it on my Kindle and I had to stop and click on a word to find out what that meant. And I felt like it was doing it so it could be literary and it just felt pretentious. Also, there were a few things that happened within the story, and this is set for the most part, I think, in like the 1990s, where the things that the characters said and thought about in reaction to these events that happened was a little bit woke. It was a little almost like so modern that it like pulled you out of the story a little bit, because you were like, would they really have thought or said that, in response to this thing that happened? I'm not really sure. So there's two quotes from Tomorrow that I wanted to read that I just really thought kind of encapsulated what it felt like to read this book. The first one is, I believe, when Sam is looking at Sadie, and it's the first time he's seen her in like 10 years. And it says, "This is what time travel is. It's looking at a person and seeing them in the present and the past concurrently. And that mode of transport only worked with those one had known for a significant time." I just thought that was really cool. And that definitely, I think, is an experience that a lot of us have. Like when we look at our parents, our siblings, or people that we've known for a long time, and you can like see them how you remember them, but you also see them in the present. And that's a method of time travel. Was really cool. And then the second one says, "There is a time for any fledgling artist where one's taste exceeds one's abilities. The only way to get through this period is to make things anyway." And as someone who does try to be creative, I just really enjoyed that quote. Second book of the month also met one of my overall 2023 goals, because this was a book by Brandon Sanderson. I read the first Misborn trilogy in 2022, and so this year, to complete my reading another new to me author, I wanted to pick up the Misborn Era 2, which is the Wax and Wane series, which has 4 books. So I actually read all 4 of those this month, and I got all 4 of those for Christmas as well. The second Misborn Era takes place about 300 years after the first Misborn Era, and these are very, very different from each other. And this is basically like a Western fantasy steampunk mystery type of story. So if that sounds intriguing to you, I do recommend this series. But this book was a disappointment for me. I knew that it was not going to be like the first set of books, but I did not expect it to be so misogynistic, and that was a big letdown. Basically, in the prologue, a woman gets fridged, which, if you're not familiar with that trope, it's a storytelling device that a lot of people use, where at the beginning of a story, a woman gets killed, and the only point of it is to further the plot of the man. So that happens right in the prologue, and just the way that the rest of the women in this book were portrayed was really disappointing. There was lots of damsels in distress and lots of like demure blushing, and it was still like scandalous for women to be seen wearing trousers, despite the fact that 300 years ago, the hero that they all based their society around wore trousers regularly. I mean, it was just really a bummer the way that Brandon Sanderson took this and portrayed women in it. So despite all that, I did really enjoy the story. It's about our main character, Wax, who has been like a lawman out in the roughs, which is basically the Wild West. And then when his uncle dies, there is no one else to take over kind of the management of his lordly duties. And so he moves back to the capital city of Ellendale to become a lord. And in the meantime, train cars full of cargo are mysteriously disappearing, and there are women from noble houses that are getting kidnapped, and nobody really knows what's going on. And so Wax and his buddy Wayne try to hunt down what's going on with these mysterious happenings. So that's the plot of the first book. It was definitely my least favorite book of this series. So after the Alloy of Law, I dove right into the Shadows of Self, which is book 2 in Mistborn Era 2. Alloy of Law ended where they found out that the bad guys they were hunting down were part of a much larger network of bad guys that they ever imagined. And so it starts with them basically still on the tail of those folks. There's also a lot of civil unrest happening in the city of Ellendale because workers are not getting paid adequately. They're being overworked. While they're in the midst of these investigations, Wax keeps seeing people that he thinks he's seen before, but that he knows are dead. And so he's trying to follow some of that down as well. There is one particular person that seems very unhinged that they believe is trying to hunt down and assassinate the governor. And so they're trying to protect the governor from this bad guy, but they also think that the governor is perhaps corrupt. And so there's some interesting things going on with that dynamic. I thought the pacing in this book was a little wonky. Of all of the books in the series, this one really ends with an emotional bang. This is the one that really, you start to see a lot more of the things from the original Mistborn trilogy starting to appear in this book, more than just like references to places or things. You actually get to see some of the creatures and the people that you know from the original trilogy. Immediately after book 2, I picked up book 3, which is The Bands of Mourning. I do want to say that the character arc that happens for Steris, who is Wax's betrothed, that happens over the course of the series is the best character growth that I've seen in a character in a long time. She starts out in the first book being pretty unlikable, and I think she is actually a really great character by the end of the series. So the more that you get to see of her throughout these books, the more she kind of develops as a person and becomes someone totally different than what you first imagine when you meet her in book 1. There were some things that happened in this book that I thought were completely unnecessary to the plot and kind of petty. Basically, what's going on in this one is that they believe Wax's sister is being held captive by bad guys, and they are trying to hunt down those bad guys and rescue his sister. Obviously, a lot more than that happens, but that's the general gist of it. There is a cool like D&D dungeon that they get into near the end of the story, which is pretty cool. At this point in the story, we get to see the magic used in a lot more interesting ways. And there's some technology developed around magic that didn't exist in the first trilogy. And so the magic, I think, really grows and starts becoming a different sort of force at this point in the series. I didn't seem to get as invested at this point in the series. I expected to be really invested, and I still wasn't. I thought this was a really good, fun story, but it just didn't hit for me the way that I expected or the way that I wanted. Because of that, I decided to give myself a little break. I was like, maybe it's just the fact that I'm binging these back to back that is what's making me lose interest. And even though that's not usually the case for me, I usually really enjoy binging series, but I was like, I just need a break. So after this one, I decided to read What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. I read my first T. Kingfisher book, Nettle and Bone. I really love Nettle and Bone. And I knew that What Moves the Dead was a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher. And I had to read The Fall of the House of Usher in my junior year English class in high school. And I remember like dissecting it with the teacher and like going through all this symbolism and stuff like that, but I didn't really remember a whole lot about it. And I knew that it was pretty short. So I actually just looked up Fall of the House of Usher online and just read it. I think it's like 30 pages or so. You can find it for free online. It took me maybe like 45 minutes to read The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. So I'm really glad that I decided to reread The Fall of the House of Usher before I picked up What Moves the Dead, because I think it gave me a greater appreciation for everything that T. Kingfisher did. She not only kept the bones of the story and really paid a beautiful homage to it, but also made the story truly her own. And it had really compelling characters. It had really interesting things that were happening. There's this weird fungi growing all around the lake. But this is a horror story. And so even though there were some like whimsical things that happened, it overall like really captured the sense of dread and horror. And even though I knew exactly what was going to happen because I had already read the Edgar Allan Poe story, I was still completely gripped at a couple of points in the story where I was just like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And it was really cool. I absolutely adored this. This was like a very high 5 stars for me. Definitely worth the read. And like I said, I read it in an afternoon. It's very short and it was really, really good. The next book that I read in the month of January, I was not planning to read this anytime soon, but I went over to visit my friend Mel and she let me borrow this book. And that is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I will fully admit I did not expect much out of this book. I am a person that normally actively avoids celebrity gossip and Hollywood drama type stuff. I don't care. I didn't really know what sort of appeal this book had for me, but so many people have talked about this book and talked about how great it was that I was definitely feeling the FOMO. And holy cow, I am so glad that I read this book. It is probably the best book that I read this month, which is shocking no one more than me. I was just absolutely entranced. Evelyn Hugo absolutely leapt off of the pages. She felt so real. This is a historical fiction about a actress named Evelyn Hugo, and she is essentially a stand-in for like a Marilyn Monroe type figure. You know, she's like coming up in her career in like the 1940s or 1950s. So the Hollywood industry, as we all know, is extremely sexist and was much more so at that time. And so the whole idea behind this is that Evelyn Hugo is a total bombshell, and she basically learns how to use her body to manipulate men in order to gain some power and influence and to further her career as an actress and gain respect. And so there's all of these different men that she marries over the years serve a very specific purpose to her. And so she's not necessarily a good person. She's extremely manipulative. But despite that, I was absolutely rooting for her throughout this whole book. You know, she's sometimes cruel. She doesn't always make the best decisions, but she's still like very relatable in like a very unrelatable sort of way. It was just a really fascinating story. The book really takes place as Evelyn is an old woman, and she has essentially hired a reporter to do a tell-all, and she is telling her life story for the very first time to this reporter who's going to be writing her memoir. And that's kind of the premise for why we're getting the story of Evelyn Hugo. Like I said, a total shocker that I really loved this, but I absolutely really loved this. So after I had that little break, I finally came back for The Lost Metal, which is book number 4, the final book of Mistborn Era 2 by Brandon Sanderson. This book, I think, was definitely the best of the 4 Wax and Wane books. For those of you who don't know, all of the books that Brandon Sanderson writes are part of what he calls the Cosmere, which is this larger world of like connected planets. And so even though Mistborn takes place on this planet called Scadrial, his other series, like the Stormlight Archives, they all take place within the same universe, but on different planets. And some of the planets know about each other and some don't. And that's kind of the intrigue, that the farther you get into Brandon Sanderson's world, the more you learn about how interconnected all of these stories are. So when Brandon Sanderson published The Lost Metal in 2022, I think there's been lots of hints and Easter eggs and stuff for readers to pick up on previously, but this book really came at it hard and really started revealing some of the mystery behind the Cosmere. So I have not read enough Brandon Sanderson to know a lot about that. I have only read Mistborn Era 1 and now Era 2, so I probably missed a lot of the references and secret things that were happening within this book that if I had been a more well-read Brandon Sanderson reader, I probably would have loved this even more. And so I would like to come back, in future years and reread this series, and I think I will probably have a higher esteem of the series after I have read a lot more Brandon Sanderson books, because I think that was kind of who it was aimed towards. But despite that, and despite the fact that I don't really know very much about the Cosmere, I absolutely thought all the parts about the Cosmere were the best parts of this book. So that was really fun to learn more about that and just kind of see some of the veil being lifted and getting to see beyond Scadrial. There were also a few cameos from characters in the first Mistborn trilogy that made an appearance here. I won't say who, but that was very interesting. I also thought the individual endings for all of our main characters in the story were very satisfying. Again, I definitely don't like these books as much as the first Misborn trilogy, but I am really intrigued to read more Brandon Sanderson in the future. The next book that I read was another book that met a goal of mine for 2022, and that was to read a Warhammer book recommended by my husband. So my husband read a ton of Warhammer books last year, and he was begging me to read some, and I really wasn't in the mood for it because military sci-fi is usually not my favorite type of sci-fi, but I promised him I would read one in 2023. So I did. I met the goal. So that was great. And it was so much better than I expected. For those of you who aren't familiar with Warhammer, Warhammer is this gigantic science fiction universe that's extremely popular in European countries. It has less popularity in the United States, but I expect that to grow and grow, especially because Henry Cavill has recently announced intentions to make a Warhammer movie, which I'm sure will be very popular. Basically, it is a grimdark universe set in the year like 40,000, which is why it's called 40K. And there are all of these warring factions of aliens, and humanity is ruled by this like immortal lord, ruler, emperor type person. Everyone is evil, and so you basically, when you play the Warhammer game, you just pick whichever evil faction you want to be, and your goal is to kill everyone else. So it's very fun, it's very brutal, it's very bleak. And so the book that my husband recommended I kick off my Warhammer experience with was For the Emperor by Sandy Mitchell. And this book is the first book out of, I believe, 10 about a character named Cephas Cain. This book had a really interesting storytelling kind of device in which Cephas Cain, this is essentially like a memoir that he wrote, but it was found by an inquisitor of the empire, has like found his memoir and has annotated it along the way to like provide additional context about these battles that were taking place, or like adding in some things that Cephas Cain left out, which is very interesting. And the Inquisitor has some very snide remarks throughout about Cephas Cain himself, it was very amusing. So Cephas is essentially this like renowned hero of the Empire, and he's like a really badass veteran that's done all these cool, amazing feats. And then when you read his memoir, you realize that he really isn't. He considers himself somewhat of a coward, and all of these accolades and awards and like battles that he's won and stuff over the years have mostly been like misconstrued, or they were mistakes, or he was actually like running away, but survived by the skin of his teeth and that sort of thing. And so he's just like slowly risen up through the ranks of his career by being a sham. And but he tries very hard to keep up those appearances. The plot of For the Emperor is that Cephas Cain has been assigned to take over a new faction and go to this outer planet where some aliens have started to colonize a planet that's supposed to belong to the Emperor, and they have to try and get the aliens off the planet without starting a war. Very shortly after he gets there, the alien ambassador is assassinated right in front of everyone, and chaos ensues. So it has very funny and interesting characters. There is gore, there's action, there's viscera. It's just a really good time. I mean, I was super impressed. I expected this to be very pulpy, and I don't know why I thought that, because my husband told me how good they were, and it was really, really good. So thank you, Michael, for making me finally read a Warhammer book. I could definitely see myself reading more Warhammer books in the future, and I could see myself continuing on with the Cephas Cain series, but it's not a high priority for me at this time. I flew through the book. I could see it being a great palate cleanser in the future. I didn't think that this book did a great job of explaining all of the different factions of the Warhammer universe super well. It gave enough context, but it didn't go super in depth, kind of with the assumption that you probably know something about these Warhammer factions and this universe already if you're picking up this book. And I didn't find that to be a problem, because I have played Warhammer the game before and do know enough about it to have felt comfortable with that sort of approach. All right, the second to last book that I completed in January was The Elephant Whisperer, My Life with the Herd in the African Wild by Lawrence Anthony with Graham Spence. I was gifted this book by my mom for Christmas, and I had absolutely no idea what this was about. I had never heard of it, but my mom read it last year and really enjoyed it and gave it to me. So I really enjoyed this, and also it was really odd. This is written by a white guy in South Africa, which gave me a little pause, but he was vocally opposed to apartheid while that was going on and made sure to point that out a few times in the book. For the most part, everything was above grade, but there were still a few comments here and there that made me go like, Also, the author is just a little bit unhinged. There was one specific point in the story where his accountant comes over to advise him and his wife on finances, and they ask him to stay and celebrate with them. And when he says, "No, I want to go home," our narrator, Lawrence, walks out to the accountant's car and shoots his tire so that he cannot leave and has to stay and celebrate with them. And I was like, you did what? Okay, yeah, that's really insane. But I think you probably have to be a little insane to run an African game reserve. So this is basically a story. This is a nonfiction story. It is about an African game reserve called Thula Thula. Lawrence Anthony is a big conservationist, and it's just about the struggles of running an institute like this. There are so many trials that a reserve like this goes through, between dealing with poachers and negotiating with local tribes, local politics and superstitions, and animal breakouts and floods and illness and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot that goes on. The story basically starts with these group of elephants who are problematic get gifted to him, because it was basically like, these animals are either going to get shot or you can take them because they're very problematic and aggressive towards humans. And so he takes them on at his reserve. He's never had elephants before. And so he's basically like faking it till he makes it, trying to learn how to care for these elephants and, acclimate them to humans enough that they don't try and attack the game wardens, but still leave them to be the wild animals that they deserve to be. And so learning about the relationships within the elephant family and how their relationship developed over time with our narrator and things like that. It was just a really cool, compelling story, and so many different bizarre and unhinged things happened that it was a quick read for me. I got through this in just a couple of days. Some parts of it were very, very sincere and heartwarming. The very last book that I read for the month of January was The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. I read The Time Machine by H.G. Wells back in high school, and it has remained one of my all-time favorite science fiction stories. And just like that one, this is a very short book. It's less than 200 pages. And I grew up watching the black and white movie. And then I did see the Tom Cruise movie that came out. And so I've known this story for most of my life, but I had never actually read the book before. I have always loved the fun fact that the radio dramatization of The War of the Worlds that was broadcast in 1938 supposedly caused a pretty big panic because some people tuned in, and this was like pre-war tensions. People tuned in and only caught part of the broadcast and thought that an actual invasion was taking place and panicked. So it's disputed how accurate that actually is or how big the panic actually was, but it's still a very fun fact that I love about War of the Worlds. My reading experience of this was wonderful. I truly understand now why this story has held up so well. I think H.G. Wells really, really captures the horror, panic, dread, and hopelessness that comes with facing an enemy that you have absolutely no chance of success against. There's a quote that one of the characters in the book said that was, "It was never a war any more than there's a war between man and the ants." And so I think this is just a really fascinating kind of look at how humanity would react in the face of that, and it's not pretty. There's some really ugly parts of human nature that are on display in this book, and I think it was done really, really well. The chapters are also very short and easy to get through, so it was a quick read for me. And I think the more modern adaptations, even the old movie and the Tom Cruise movie, kind of updated the story to make it relevant to the time period in which those movies came out. This book came out in 1895, and that's also when the book is set. And I actually really loved that about this story and the aspect of how that changed the story that I know from the more modern movies, because, when the invasion is first taking place, the only way that people can learn about it is word of mouth or newspapers. And so the aliens really get a strong foothold before anyone really starts to understand what's going on, because news travels so slowly. And then even when people are understanding what's going on and trying to escape, there are no automobiles. There's trains, but the trains quickly get derailed by aliens. And so people are like, horse and buggy, they're on bicycles, they're on foot, and they're just doing everything that they can to run to somewhere that they think they might be safe. I thought that was a really kind of awesome setting for an alien invasion story, and I would like to see a more true adaptation of that story on screen sometime in the future, just because I thought that was really, really cool. So as I said, this was a better reading month for me than I had at any month in 2022, and I'm stoked about continuing my reading in 2023. I already have a ton of great reads lined up for February. I've got some books on hold at the library that I'm super excited about, and I can't wait to tell you guys about more great books in the future. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed this content. As always, be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come.